Alright, so next we are still with Charlemagne, and we're now discussing a little bit of the same time frame, Louis of Aquitaine, who eventually will become King of France. Now Louis the Pious here, he is not yet, but he will become. And, well, Eleanor of Aquitaine is one of the famous ones, but he was first known as Louis of Aquitaine. Anyway, some pictures of him. Now, I'm going to go back to the map because I think right now we're still within war and struggle and border and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, so right there. Switch it back. It appears to have been at this period that Louis obtained his father's permission to give the title of queen to Ermengarde, daughter to Count Ingram, one of the most powerful noblemen in Aquitaine. He had previously married this lady, but thought a prince was allowed to take a wife but though a prince was allowed to take a wife without the consent of his parents, he could not raise her to the dignity of queen. The dissensions of the Moorish chiefs invited Charles to the conquest of the islands of Majorca and Menorca. Good heavens, they never stopped traveling. I can't believe it. Now they're all out on the islands. But the satisfaction attending this expedition was more than balanced by the tumults which reigned at Rome. Two nephews of the deceased pontiff, Pascal and Campule, jealous of the elevation of Leo, he formed a design to take away his life. The day of a solemn procession was the time fixed upon the execution of their project. They accordingly made a furious attack on the person of the Pope and shut him up in a convent, whence he had the good fortune to effect his escape during the night, and hastened to the residence of the French ambassadors, was by them conducted to Spoleto. From thence he wrote to the king, who invited him to repair to his camp at Paderborn in Westphalia, where he was received with all the honours due to his station. Charles appointed a certain number of prelates to accompany him to Rome, and to examine the different accusations that had been preferred against him. For Pascal and Campuel had already presented a request to the kings, charging Leo with the commission of several enormous crimes. The commissaries, after the most careful investigation, assured the monarch of the Pope's innocence, and his two accusers were immediately arrested. But as they had still many friends at Rome, Charles, in order to restore perfect tranquillity to that city, resolved to repair thither in person. 800 A.D. In a few days after his arrival, he assembled the clergy and nobles of both nations in the church of St. Peter, where, after hearing the accusers of Leo, he declared them guilty of gross calumny, and pronounced the justification of the sovereign pontiff. Falsehoods, gross falsehoods. As a testimony of his gratitude, Leo resolved to confer to his benefactor the dignified title of Emperor of the West. It was on the festival of Christmas, after Charles had devoutly assisted at the celebration of Mass in the Church of St. Peter, that the Pope suddenly placed a crown on his head, and the dome resounded with the exclamations of "Long live to Charles the August, crowned by the hand of God! Long live and victory to the great and pacific Emperor of the Romans!" The Pope immediately consecrated his head and body by the royal unction, and conducting him to a throne, paid him those marks of respect which had been only claimed by the ancient Caesars. In his familiar conversation with his secretary Eginhard, Charles, who indissolubly blended in the name of Charlemagne, the appellation of Magnus, Great, also protected his ignorance of the intentions of Leo, and declared he had known them. He would have disappointed them by his absence on that memorable day. But the preparations for the ceremony must have disclosed the secret, and though the son of Pepin affected to despise a title which was accompanied by no real advantages, yet in his correspondence with the emperors of the East he exacted with a scrupulous jealousy the acquiescence in the dignity which he derived from the gratitude of the successors of Saint Peter. Okay. Acquiescence. That's one of my worst ones. 802 AD. The high degree of power now enjoyed by Charlemagne, by which name we shall hereafter distinguish this monarch, might have enabled him to conquer that part of Italy which was possessed by the Greeks. Of this the Empress Irene was aware, and therefore spared no pains to avert the misfortune she dreaded. By putting her son to death, she had acquired the government of the Eastern Empire, and she now endeavoured to secure the protection of Charlemagne. At this time a widower, by a proposal of marriage, the emperor encouraged the plan, and 2 of his ambassadors had been sent to Constantinople to settle the preliminaries, when that princess was deposed by Nicephorus, who, being crowned Emperor of the East, banished Irene to the island of Lesbos. Well, we can say Lesbos, but I believe it is Lesbos, something like that. The first care of the usurper was to send ambassadors to the French court for the purpose of establishing a French intercourse between the 2 empires. Charlemagne, on their arrival, was at his palace of Seltz, where, in order to give them an idea of the French magnificence and to humble the arrogance of the Greeks, he resolved to receive them in such a manner as should equally surprise and embarrass them. They were led to their first audience through 4 spacious apartments, superbly decorated, in which the officers of the king's household were distributed. all richly clothed and standing in a respectful manner before the chief of their respective offices. In the first apartment, in which the constable was seated on a kind of throne, the ambassadors were about to prostrate themselves before him, but were prevented by an assurance that this was only one of the officers belonging to the crown. The same air occurred on the second, which contained the count of the palace, attended by a splendid retinue of the chamberlain presided. By increasing their uncertainty, gave rise to fresh mistakes, and the farther they advanced, the greater magnificence was displayed. These sentences go on and on, don't they? At length, I don't know if you class them as run-ons or what, but they sure do go on and on. At length, two noblemen approached and conducted them to the emperor's apartment. Charlemagne was standing near the window, surrounded by his children and by a great number of dukes and prelates, with whom he was engaged in familiar conversation. He was leaning on the shoulder of Bishop Heton, to whom he appeared to pay a greater degree of attention than the rest of the nobles, because he had been treated with greater contempt of his embassy at the Count of Constantinople. The ambassadors, alarmed, threw themselves at his feet, but Charlemagne, perceiving their embarrassment, raised them up and dispelled their fears by telling them that Heton forgave them, and that he himself, at the solicitation of the bishop, was willing to forget what had passed. And now your teacher is saying, did you follow that? You get an F. The treaty which they came to negotiate was speedily signed. It was agreed that Charlemagne and Nicephorus should both retain the appellation of Augustus, that the former should take the title of Emperor of the West, and the latter that of Emperor of the East. That part of Italy, which extends, here goes Italy, that extends from the Osanto and the Volturno to the Sicilian Sea, should remain subject to the Eastern Empire, and that all the rest should belong to the Western Empire, together with the two Pannonias, Dacia, Istria, Liburnia, and Dalmatia. This treaty was followed by the submission of Grimiod, Duke of Benevento, in 803 AD, who had revolted at the instigation of the Greeks. In 804, the Saxons were now the only people who resisted the authority of Charlemagne. Though they had so often suffered for their obstinacy, they now took up arms again under the conduct of Godfrey, King of Denmark, a prince of great power, both by sea and land. The emperor immediately marched to attack them, and advancing as far as the Elbe, drove them from the most inaccessible retreats. The Danish prince, who was on the frontiers of his dominions with a numerous body of cavalry, proposed an accommodation and promised to meet Charlemagne, but he suddenly changed his mind, and retired with precipitation. The rebels, deprived of his support, had recourse to the clemency of their sovereign, who, in order to prevent any future insurrection, sent one half of them to Switzerland, and the other into Flanders, and gave their country to the Abodrites, who had always preserved their fidelity. But a change of climate seldom produces a change of manners. These emigrants, to the number of 10,000 families, emigrant with an E, far from losing their ferociousness with their country, infected their new allies with that spirit of revolt which always resided in their own bosoms. It became a proverb during the troubles in Flanders under the reign of Philip of Valois, that Charlemagne, by mixing the Saxons with the Flemings, of one devil had made two. So Saxons were known as devils. By mixing them with the Flemings, they have become two devils. From this time, however, Saxony was free from commotions, and that proud nation which had hitherto resisted the yoke with such persevering courage was at length induced, partly by force and partly from inclination, to submit to the rites of baptism and to acknowledge the sovereignty of Charlemagne. In 806, the emperor, after the total reduction of Saxony, repaired to Rheims to wait for the Pope, who had asked his permission to make a journey to France. The pretended motive for this excursion was to discourse with him on the subject of a miracle said to have occurred at Mantua. But its real object was to confer on the affairs of Venice. The result of the conference is not mentioned by the historians of those times, but the return of the sovereign pontiff by the exarchate of Ravenna, the numerous army raised at this period by Wilher, an effort which greatly exceeded the power of an individual, the sudden eruption of that tribute into the island of Malamau, which he reduced, the capture of Heraclea, from, did it say Maurice? Oh, yeah, it did. It said Maurice. From Maurice and John, who favoured the party of Nicephorus. The re-establishment of the Patriarch Fortunatus, who, notwithstanding the protection of Leo, had been expelled from his church at Grado. Such a puzzle, isn't it? History. All these circumstances occurring at this conjuncture seem to authorize the opinion that they were occasioned by the late interview between Charlemagne and the Pope. The ancient annalists are strangely confused in their accounts on the Magna and the Pope. I'm sorry, no, they weren't confused by them. They were confused in their accounts of the government of the state of Venice. It appears, however, that the district which lies on the continent, on the northern coast of Gulf, was holden of the Western Empire, while the neighbouring isles were submitted in appearance to the domination of the East, but were in fact independent. There are several historical records which tend to prove that those islands, in imitation of some of the seaport towns in Dalmatia, were inclined to acknowledge the authority of Charlemagne, and that with this view they sent envoys to him at Thionville. So down here with Croats and the Serbs. Eginhard, in speaking of and Dalmatia, was subject to his orders. No. I'm sorry. In speaking of this deputation, formally says, everything which regarded the dukes and people of Venice and Dalmatia was subject to his orders. Such a declaration evidently implies a sovereign authority, and must effectually destroy the system of those who maintain that at this time, at this early period, Venice was a free and independent state. So he's trying to say that Venice was not a free and independent state. It was under the king. While a momentary calm allowed him a suspension from the labours of the field, Charlemagne settled, at an assembly holden at Thionville, the final distribution of his dominions. Aquitaine and Gascony, with the Spanish March, he assigned to his sons Louis. His possessions in Italy he confirmed to Pepin, and added them to the best part of Bavaria, with the country at present inhabited by the Griffons. The rest of his dominions he left to his eldest son Charles, whom he destined for the empire. And after publicly subscribing the royal donation, he rendered it, in a superstitious age, more authentic by the sanction of the Roman pontiff. He did not confine himself to merely settling the quantum of territory which each was to possess, but his foresight extended to every future ground of disquiet and subject of discontent. In order to secure a lasting peace and firm union between the brothers, he stipulated that in case any difference should arise, which the testimony of men should prove inadequate to settle, recourse should be had, not to the general mode of decision by duel, but to the judgment of the cross. This was a custom then in vogue, which, though ridiculous to the extreme, was still regarded as a Solomon appeared to the Almighty. In the decision of doubtful matters, 2 men were chosen who were being conducted to the church. They were stood erect with their hands lifted up in the shape of a cross during the celebration of divine service, and the cause was determined in favour of him whose champion remained motionless for the longest space of time. So they had to hold their arms up, the shape of the cross, the longest. Who could hold the longest? Oh, God heavens. Right, but now no more duel. They're saying you can't get out there and duel any longer. So at some point, they were dueling. Remember, these were with sabers. They were not dueling with guns. but they are bringing it up. The foils. Soon after the determination of this grand affair, the three princes were summoned to defend their new dominions by the force of arms. In Aquitaine and Italy, Louis and Pepin triumphed over the infidels, whom the former expelled from the island of Corsica, and the latter defeated in Catalonia. The revolted Sclavonians, who had ravaged Bohemia, were crushed by the power of Charles, and the declining age of Charlemagne lifted with paternal fondness to the martial achievements of his sons. In 808, the king of Aquitaine was recalled from the pursuit of his conquests in Spain by intelligence that a fleet of Normans had entered the Channel and was directing its course towards the maritime parts of his dominions. These Normans, or men of the north, were a body of ravagers, composed of Norwegians, Swedes, Frisians, Danes, and adventurers of all nations, who, being accustomed to a roving, unsettled life, they were roaming around, roving, unsettled, they took delight in nothing but war and plunder. Oh no, I'm a Norman here. Oh, again I'm found out. Charlemagne, foreseeing the evils they were likely to bring upon France, exclaimed with a sigh, "If notwithstanding the extent of my power, they dare insult the coasts of my empire, what will they not attempt when that power shall be disunited?" He's really worried over their takeover. The event fully justified the prediction. The king, however, adopted the most prudent measures for restraining their incursions. He visited all the seaports and caused such a prodigious number of vessels to be constructed that, according to Eginhard, no part of the coast was provided with them. From the mouth of the Tiber to the extremity of his German dominions, all these vessels he ordered to be kept constantly armed and equipped, and he obliged the nobles to serve on board them in case of attack, in the same manner as they were bound to serve by land. His grand marine arsenal was established at Boulogne, where he erected an ancient pharos that had been constructed by the Emperor Caligula, and gave the most positive orders that a fire should be kept burning in it during the whole night. It is that which is now called the Tour de Ordre, the Tour of Order, a pillar of. Of all the Western Empire, Godfrey, King of Denmark, was the only prince that still refused to acknowledge the authority of Charlemagne. The emperor now prepared to invade his dominions, and the Dane, aware of his hostile intentions and unawed by the extent of his power, threw down the gauntlet of defiance and made incursions into the territories of the Abodrites. Having formed a league with some of the neighboring people, he extended his depredations into the province of Mecklenburg, whose inhabitants alarmed at his approach and terrified at the rapidity of his progress, threw down their arms and submitted to the imposition of an annual tribute. The conqueror then marched forward to the banks of the Elbe and reduced several fortified places. One fort, however, withstood his most vigorous efforts, and he was compelled to raise the siege. After having lost a great number of men and many of his principal officers, this check and the news of Charles' approach hastened his return, and afraid of encountering the superior force of the French, he totally demolished the port of Réric, from which he derived a considerable revenue. He carried his precautions to a still greater height, and in order to secure his dominions from hostile eruptions, he erected a high wall, defended by strong towers, which extended from one end to the other of that neck of land which lies between the German Ocean and the Baltic Sea. Okay, German Ocean and Baltic Sea. I can't even find it on this. Alright, I'll have to find it somehow. Such was the situation of affairs when young Charles reached the banks of the Elbe. He immediately passed that river, and advancing far into the country, spread terror and devastation around him. At length, finding no enemy to encounter, and the season being far advanced, he marched back to France, after having erected 2 forts on the confines of Saxony. So now he's got a big worry here of the Normans, so now it's begun. He's trying to fortify, and I will repeat again who they declare Normans as. They are composed of Norwegians, Swedes, Frisians, Danes, and adventurers of all nations, who, being accustomed to a roving, unsettled life, took delight in nothing but war and plunder. So these are the beginnings of William the Conqueror of England. The group. All right, I might take a small pause. Let me just click this off for a second. I dare say, are we going to be unhappy when this book is over? I don't know. This is it. It's all we get. You know, this was history, written by all of these amazing, and they really were the amazing historians. It was all gathered works from Franche of Velay, Villaret, Garnier, Mézières, and Daniel, and a few other eminent historians, all put together by John Gifford, with his notes of critical and explanatory. I still can't believe he did all this work and put it into chronological order at that time. It's almost a near impossibility. And we cry over AI isn't doing this for us. Unbelievable. In 809, so we've got the forts, we've got the burning little fire there, and the chore that burns at night. While these transactions were passing in the Western Empire, the truce that had been concluded between the Venetians and the Emperor of the East expired, and both parties prepared for the renewal of hostilities. The fleet of Nicephorus appeared in the Gulf of Venice. So now we're down there in the Venice again, under the command of Paul, who detached a part of it to surprise Camaccio, a town situated in a bay near the mouth of Po. But the garrison made a folly, in which the Greeks were repulsed and compelled to re-embark with the utmost precipitation. They then directed their course towards Puppoloni, now Piombino, which they took and pillaged. Paul, nevertheless, caused proposals for an accommodation to be made, and to which the King of Italy was inclined to listen. But it was the interest of the Venetians to widen the breach between the two empires. The Dukes Wilher and Bayeux, who had 3 years before placed themselves under the protection of the French, took such effectual pains to prevent the conclusion of peace, and to increase the subsisting animosity, that the commander of the Grecians, thinking his life was in danger, retired without coming to any arrangement. The following year it appeared that these noblemen were not more faithful to Charlemagne than to Nicephorus. They were not more faithful to Charlemagne than to Nicephorus. So Pepin, enraged at their duplicity, he attacked the forces they had collected by land and sea, defeated them in several engagements, and compelled them to sue for pardon. This exploit put an end to the war between the two empires. Peace was concluded, Venice restored to the Greeks, and Dalmatia to the French. So now the French are on that side, over at the Croat zone, and Venice is still going to the Greeks way over there. So it's a little bit iffy there, sketchy who has what. The capture of Piombino was not the only disgrace which attended the French arms during this campaign. In Spain, they were tarnished by the loss of Tortosa. Oh no, they're losing it. Which the King of Aquitaine in vain endeavoured to retake. At the siege of Hueca, too, that monarch was equally unsuccessful, but in Germany the situation of affairs was more pleasing and prosperous. The king, so I'm confused because he said the King of Aquitaine in vain endeavoured to retake. It was in vain. He couldn't take Tortosa, nor Hueca. The King of Denmark, notwithstanding the strength of his entrenchments, was anxious to appease the resentment of Charlemagne. Okay, I've got to loosen the binding of this book. I hate to do that, but I can barely read it. Oh gosh, dang it! It's not worth 100,000. Okay, well, where am I? Oh, I hate losing money. That's the way it goes. Okay, so Wilher and Bayeux, we've restored the Venice. We're at the capture of Piombino. We've done all this. The King of Denmark. Yeah, he's having problems. Aquitaine could not take Spain. The king of Denmark, notwithstanding the strength of his entrenchments, was anxious to appease the resentment of Charlemagne. A conference was appointed for that purpose, but it passed in mutual complaints, and no plan of accommodation being adopted. Duke Tressisson, by the orders of Charlemagne, renewed hostilities, and in short retook all the places which Godfrey had subdued. The Danish monarch threatened the Abderdites with destruction, and talked of invading both Saxony and Friesland. The emperor, informed of his threats, sent a body of troops to seize the principal passages of the Elbe, and to erect a fortress at Essefeld. This precaution disconcerted the projects of the Dane, and obliged him to direct his efforts to another quarter. In 810 A.D., Godfrey had assembled his troops, embarked them on board a fleet of 200 sail, and made a descent on Friesland with 200 ships, where he defeated a united body of French and Frisians, took many places of importance, and compelled the inhabitants to pay tribute. The emperor no sooner received intelligence of his motions than he passed the Rhine and advanced as far as the Weser. But he had scarcely pitched his tents when he was informed that the enemy was retiring in disorder, and that the Danish prince had been assassinated by one of his guards. This event put an end to the war. Hemming, the son of successor of Godfrey, and Hemming was really the name of his son and successor of Godfrey, humbly sued for peace, and obtained it by a renunciation of all his father's conquests. Peace was also concluded on the same conditions with the Saracens of Spain. The king of Cordova either openly surrendered or secretly favoured the recapture of all the places which had been taken from the French. The river Elbe was fixed on as the limits of the two states. So this river Ebro is extremely important, and I am not finding it. It is another. It actually might not be. Oh no, I have Elbe. I have the river Elbe, but not Ebro. Might be the same. Recently, a severe. So the limits of the two states. The Gascons had recently received a severe chastisement. Chastisement. The Navarres, and the Navarres, I guess it would be called the Navarres, began to grow accustomed to the French yoke, so that a perfect submission prevailed throughout the vast extent of the country, which was distinguished by the appellation of the Spanish March. The satisfaction experienced by Charlemagne on the establishment of peace and tranquillity was embittered by the death of Pepin, King of Italy, an infant son of that prince named Bernard. The infant son was appointed by the disconsolate emperor to succeed to the Italian sceptre. In 812, in a few months after this severe loss, he had fresh cause for lamentation in the death of his eldest son, Charles, who died in the 35th year of his age. All his hopes were now centered in his remaining child, Louis, King of Aquitaine, a prince who bore the highest reputation for prudence, economy, and valor. Indeed, the extraordinary accounts that were given to the emperor of the valuable qualities of this youthful monarch was such as to stagger even paternal credulity. Resolved, however, to ascertain what degree of credit was due of them, he dispatched Archnebold, here we come, a person of whom veracity he could depend, to the court of Aquitaine, with orders to watch with the strictest attention the conduct of Louis. The report of this courtier was favourable to the wishes of Charlemagne, who finding that his son supported the dignity of a monarch without oppressing his subjects, exclaimed, "Oh, my companions, let us rejoice that this young man is already wiser and more skilful than ourselves." So Charlemagne sent someone there to check up on old Aquitaine and old Louis, and apparently he was still with the king, with Charlemagne. The aged emperor, feeling his strength decay, this is in 813, and the weight of public cares becoming too burdensome for him to bear without assistance, now determined on the association of Louis to the empire. He'd lost one son, definitely his Charles, and now he had Louis that he checked up on. Arrayed in his emperor, I believe there's another son there as well. He might have died already. Arrayed in his imperial robes, with a crown of gold upon his head, and supported by his son, he repaired to the magnificent chapel which he had built at Aix-la-Chapelle, and after inculcating in the mind of his inoculating, it wants to be inoculating, but it's inculcating in the mind of his youthful colleague the duties of a monarch and a man, he commanded him to take the crown which had been placed on the altar and put on his head. In 814, the increasing infirmities of Charlemagne soon warned him to prepare for this end. About the middle of the month of January, which succeeded the association of Louis, he was attacked by a fever, and conscious of his danger, he beheld with firmness the approach of death. On the 27th, a fainting fit announced his speedy dissolution. And on the 28th, after uttering in a low and faltering voice these words, "Into thy hands, Lord, I commend my spirit," he immediately expired on the 72nd year of his age, in the 47th of his reign. Most of the biographers of Charlemagne appear to have considered themselves as panegriffs, and not as historians, and even such as have refused him indiscriminate commendation have injudiciously bestowed their censors where they were not deserved, and withheld them where they ought to have been applied. The splendid qualities in this brave emperor are, indeed, well calculated to fascinate the mind and dazzle the judgment, nor were they only obscured by trivial defects. Should we think it proper to dwell on the partial diminution of their splendour, when their general glare would justify admiration? But fatal as a deep flaw to a diamond of the first water is the cruelty of Charlemagne to the general excellence of his character. The silent extinction of the sons of Carloman is a gross impeachment of his humanity, and even could he elude the doubtful fate of his nephews, the wanton massacre of 4,500 Saxons who were beheaded on the same spot, bespeak the unfeeling hero of a barbarous age. That spirit of ambition, too, which inspired him with an inordinate thirst for conquest, and led him to invade the rights and destroy the independence of his neighbours, is surely no theme for praise. On the other hand, we contemplate with pleasure his numerous virtues. In the infancy of legislative skill, his regulations for the preservation of order and public tranquillity throughout his extensive dominions, together with his strict and impartial administration of justice, merit the highest commendation. So, and yes, of his valour we say little. It is a gift of nature that forms perhaps a just theme of gratitude to the possessor, but it is not a fit subject for historical praise. Of a different description are his zeal to protect and his anxiety to cultivate the arts and sciences, his studious attention to the duties of religion, his fervent piety, rigid temperance, unbounded charity, and finally his extreme earnestness to improve and mollify the manners of his subjects, and to promote their welfare and felicity. His counsels to his son and colleague, Louis, which exhort him to consider the people as his children, to be gentle in his administration, but firm in the execution of justice, to reward merit, to promote his nobles gradually, to choose his ministers. It was ministers. To choose his ministers deliberately, but never to remove them capriciously, are maxims that cannot too strongly recommend nor easily be adopted. Not too easily adopted. So he was loved and adored in one moment with the people to some respect, but he was still not one to be given full praise, because he was still a warrior. Anyway, so the authority of Charlemagne embraced that part of Spain which extended from the Pyrenees to the river Ebro, that comprehends Roussillon and Catalonia, Navarre and Aragon. In Italy, his power was acknowledged from the Alps to the borders of Calabria. To the sceptre of France he united that of Germany, and to the schools which he established in the barbarous regions on either side of the Weser, in some measure atone for the cruelties he perpetrated in the pursuit of dominion. So his schools, some measure, atone for all that he's done. The empire of the Franks stretched between the east and the west, from the Ebro to the Elbe, or Vistula, and between the north and the south, from the Duchy of Benevento to the river Eider, Eyder, which still separates Denmark from Germany. Very important river. The body of this monarch was oh my gosh, here it comes. It's death time. The body of this monarch was deposited in a vault in his chapelle on Etau. Oh my gosh, chapelle Etau. Well, I want to say en chapelle, but yes, in his chapel, where he was seated on a throne of gold, arrayed in the imperial robes, and in the hair cloth which he commonly wore, with his sword at his side and the crown on his head, the Bible on his knees, and his shield and sceptre at his feet. These last were of gold, and deemed highly valuable in the superstitious age, less from the precious metal of which they were composed than from the benediction from which they had been bestowed on them by Pope Leo. Beneath the regal mantle was placed the large pilgrim's purse, which he always carried with him on his journey to Rome. The whole sepulchre was scented with perfume, and filled with a vast quantity of pieces of gold. Over the entrance was erected a superb triumphal arch, on which the following epitaph was inscribed: "Here rests the body of Charles, the great and orthodox emperor, who gloriously extended the kingdom of the French, and governed it happily during 47 years. Charlemagne had 4 wives, who were honoured with the appellation of queen: Hermengard, Hildegard, Fastrade, Luitgard. From the first, who was daughter to the last king of the Lombards, he was divorced by the advice of the bishops. By the second, he had 4 sons, Charles, Pepin, Louis, and Lothaire, who died young, and 5 daughters, Adelaide, Rotrud, Bertha, Giselle, and Hildegard. Bertha was mother to Theodrade of Hiltrud. Okay, so now I'm getting genealogy here. We've got it. We've got who was who. Named Hilmitrude. Oh, sorry. Oh, gosh, here we are. Mother to Theodrade and Hiltrude. Both abbes, they're calling them. Abbes. The first of Famoutier, and the last of Argenteuil. The emperor, before his marriage with Hermengard, had taken a concubine named Hilmitrude, by whom he had Pepin, surnamed the Humpbacked, and the princess Rothay. After the death of Luitgard, having 3 sons who were capable of swaying the sceptre, he resolved to have no more wives who could enjoy the pabble of swaying the scepter. I'm sorry, that was not it. Who he didn't want any more wives after that. Who could enjoy the title of queen or empress. He therefore took successively 4 concubines who gave birth to several children. By Maldegard he had Rethilda, by Gerwinda or Gerswinda, Alditrude, and by Regine, Hugh the abbot, Dragon, bishop of Metz, and Adelinde, and by Adelaide or Adelvide, the Adele of life, Adelvide of plenty or something, he had Thierry, who took orders. He had a huge family apparently. Okay, he had also another daughter named Emma, who it has been pretended was wife to England. I'm sorry, not wife to England, Eginhard. Sorry, there's no wife to England here. It was Eginhard. So great, a number of wives and concubines has given occasion to some modern authors to pollute the memory of Charlemagne with the charge of incontinence and immorality. It is needless to repeat that we have been urged in favour of concubinage, which was then regarded as a connection equally lawful with the present left-handed marriages of Germany. Right? Left-banded. It could be either left-handed or banded. And the French marriages of conscience. So, massive family. But a few reflections on the subject of this unjust accusation. We must not withhold. It is probable that a prince who was frank, open, and sincere in all his actions should descend to the little arts. Oh no, I've lost it. Anyway, I'm sorry. Should descend. Yes, there it is. Yeah, to the little arts of hypocrisy. All right. So there's a small art of hypocrisy. That offspring of a mean, uncontracted mind, and prove faithless to those laws which he openly professed to support and protect. Okay, so let's return to the art of hypocrisy, that offspring of a mean and contracted mind, and prove faithless to those laws which he openly professed to support and protect. Oh my God. Yeah, that's a toughie. Which he in that case have dared to promulgate that famous ordinance in which he places fornication and adultery in the list of those heinous sins which draw down the vengeance of heaven on such as practice them. Had he himself been guilty of a crime which in others he punished with imprisonment and confiscation, instead of exciting esteem and conciliating affection, he must inevitably have become an object of contempt and indignation to his subjects. Eginhard, though his secretary, is not sparing of his reproaches where he thinks they are due. He accuses Charlemagne of a culpable want of firmness in forbearing to repress the cruelties of Fastrade and the licentiousness conduct of his daughters, who, he seems, were most of them endued with very amorous dispositions. He would not therefore have failed to notice the moral incontinence of his sovereign, had it really existed. So he is a bit two-faced here, being immoral with all of this family of all places, and yet he's telling everyone else they better straighten up and fly right. Okay, so Eginhard, so we're back to Eginhard. Licentiousness. He was about okay. He would not therefore have failed to notice the moral incontinence of his sovereign had it really existed. The historian of Louis the Gentle, Louis. Oddly, in this book I haven't mentioned it. It is written Lewis. I am not sure why they changed it, but they did change it away from the Louis. The historian of Louis the Gentle, speaking of the emperor's death, says, "Mortuus est vir justus." The councils of Verneuil and Rome rank him in the number of those great monarchs whom they dignify with the appellation of great saints, and all contemporary writers mention him in the same terms. Now he's a saint. It was not till many centuries after his death that any doubts arose as to the purity of his manners, as if it were impossible that a man who had attained this age of 72 should have married 9 wives successfully. From these considerations we must pronounce the accusation of immorality, with regard to his intercourse with the fair sex, to be wholly unfounded, though we can by no means assent to the indiscriminate commendation of the eloquent Buzet, who says that he was a most Christian prince in all his actions. The first sumptuary laws known in France were enacted during this reign. They were regulated the prince of stuffs, and the faults that were to be worn by each class of citizens, the sorts that were to be worn by each class of citizens. The emperor himself, have I gone on too long? Yes, a bit long, so I'll start this one again. But yeah, apparently he's a bit of a two-face. He's got 9 wives, and yet he's a saint, and yes, he's killed lots of people and taken off all their heads and conducted many wars. So why was he given that classification of saint? Well, I would say because he perpetuated Christianity throughout, and thus he was deemed important to pass the sainted word around. Looks like that would be the main reason. You know, it was advertisement for the Catholic Church, and he was a major player.